My name is Kathryn Olivarius, and I'm an assistant professor of history at Stanford University.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're going to be discussing your book, Necropolis, today. And so maybe you could begin by telling us how you came to this topic and what you discovered while writing it.
Sure. This is my first book. This is what we in the biz call your PhD book. So I wrote my PhD on this, and I actually had no intention of writing about yellow fever before I got into the archives. I had this sort of vision of writing about how the slave experience changed in Louisiana after the Louisiana Purchase. So as it transferred from a French and colonial outpost to American rule. But when I actually got into the archives in New Orleans for the first time, what struck me most was how you would read these letters. And this was, letter after letter, box after box, these are letters between husband and wife, between business partners, et cetera. And they'd be 8 pages long, and 5 pages of these letters would be dedicated to disease and symptoms and fear of disease, and not just any disease, but yellow fever, which is a disease that I, I'm ashamed to say even now that I knew about. I knew that it existed, and I knew that it still was dangerous in various parts of the world, that it still killed people in various parts of West Africa and South America. But I didn't know much more than that. And I really didn't know that this was a scourge of the United States and of the sort of greater Caribbean for many hundreds of years. And, my family has always sort of joked that I'm what they call a historical hypochondriac. I would come home from school and I would be convinced that, I had leprosy or HIV or cholera or something. I scared them more than once coming home and just announcing, that I had one of these diseases. So they weren't that surprised that I sort of took this disease turn. But when I then started reading more widely on yellow fever in Louisiana and in New Orleans in particular, I discovered that there were quite a few books already written about yellow fever and how this shaped the sort of environment and ecology of the space. But, the sort of literature on slavery and capitalism, which was sort of hot when I was doing my PhD, this literature never mentioned yellow fever. You could read these books and have no idea that every second or third summer, about 8 to 10% of the population would die from yellow fever. And this is the largest slave trading port in the United States during the antebellum period. This is the largest cotton export city. And so I thought, in some sense, there's a sort of gap here. And the way that I came to think about it was that yellow fever was not just kind of background noise to the more resonant stories of the antebellum South. So the sort of lead up to the Civil War or Western expansion or the explosion in slavery and cotton, but actually a sort of crucial plot point in each of these stories, that this fundamentally shaped the entire way that this sort of ecosystem operated. So this is more like dark matter rather than some background noise, if you will.
Well, and I think you do that exceptionally well in the book, tying how yellow fever kind of determines the class, race, economic structure of New Orleans. But I think before we get into even that, what is yellow fever? How do we get it? And what does it do to us?
So this is what we know now. And I should say that basically none of this was known to people 200 years ago. So yellow fever is an acute hemorrhagic fever. It's sort of in the same family as Zika and dengue. And it is mosquito-borne, so it's spread by mosquitoes. So it's not contagious in the sense that it's spread from human to human through contact, like many other diseases are. And this was confusing to people in the past. So basically, an infected mosquito who is just bit somebody who either is infected with yellow fever or is harboring it in their blood, they bite you, they regurgitate a little bit into your bloodstream, and then you become infected. And then you're infected too. So if another mosquito bites you, it can pass it on to another person. So, if you have a densely packed human population, you have lots of mosquitoes living, in this sort of hot and humid environment that is the ideal feeding environment for mosquitoes, this can spread very, very fast. So this is a virus, and yellow fever it remains a very horrible way to die. We still have no cure. In fact, we have a very effective vaccination, but we still have no cure. So essentially, if you're bitten by an infected mosquito and you're not vaccinated, you will experience symptoms sort of vary, but they can happen quite quickly. So you'll experience headaches, nausea, chills. Often victims describe this pain in their lower back and the small of their back. Eventually, you'll get a very high fever, and grow delirious. Eventually, patients will lapse into a coma at the end of their illness as their organs shut down. They'll go jaundiced as their liver shuts down. And the sort of telltale symptom of yellow fever is black vomit. So you regurgitate this thick kind of coagulated blood that looks a lot like coffee grounds at the very end of your illness. It was a very, very painful way to die. I've seen many, many examples that even the most pious ministers and rabbis screaming profanities at the end of their illness. So we know now, of course, that it's mosquito-borne. We know sort of the prophylaxis of yellow fever. We know a great deal about this disease. 2 centuries ago, and before, they had very, very little idea about how this disease was spread, how it was transmitted, and what the prognosis was for any individual. So there was no cure. Again, there was no vaccination. There was no conclusive evidence of disease transmission. So the mosquito vector would not be discovered until the very end of the 19th century. A vaccine wouldn't be developed until the 20th century. And there was no conclusive evidence as for why some people remain asymptomatic and others died these, sort of gruesome and grisly deaths. So this, of course, sort of sea of misinformation sort of develops around this. Everybody was a self-styled yellow fever expert back in the day, though really nobody knew very much about it.
Yeah, and not getting into the kind of medical quackery side of it, where they were doing crazy things to try to cure and abate the disease. But maybe we could talk instead about this idea of survival. I mean, obviously, if you die, you're gone. But there was this survival took on a new tone and tenor towards yellow fever. And I'm going to say this wrong, but I think it's acclimation.
Acclimation, yeah.
Acclimation, yeah, there you go. So if you could tell us what that was in the context of yellow fever in New Orleans, and then how that led to the rise of immuno-capitalism.
So that's precisely right. So acclimation was the process of surviving yellow fever, or more generally, adapting to the torrid climate. So definitions of acclimation varied quite a bit, not just within the South and within the greater Atlantic, but also across the 18th and 19th centuries. Many people had various different sort of ideas about what this actually entailed. But one of the things that, so I just said that people in the past didn't really understand much about this disease, but they did understand one very crucial fact, which was that if you survived the disease, you became immune for life, that you had this very thorough lifetime immunity. It's much more thorough than, for example, immunity to COVID-19. The likelihood of you getting it twice is almost nil after you've survived an infection. So you basically have this, if you get sick with yellow fever, you have you will face, one of two equally likely outcomes. So either you'll die. That's 50% of people will die. The other half will become so-called acclimated. And that means they're immune for life. They're, safe from all future epidemics. And one of the things that's really interesting about acclimation, so this is invisible. This is one of the things that's really important about this. So if you survive yellow fever, good for you. That's excellent. That means that you're not going to die from it in the future. But actually proving this is really quite difficult because unlike syphilis or smallpox, for example, you're not going to be left with physical scars. A lot of, so if you survive smallpox, often you'll be sort of pockmarks on your face, and you can see this. This is true across the board in all manner of sources. So you can sort of prove to people that you've had this and you've survived. There's no such thing as kind of definitive bodily proof that you survived yellow fever. So you have to sort of perform your acclimation. So you see this sort of class system develop in New Orleans. So the one that probably most people are familiar with, and the one that will resonate across the Atlantic world, is this tripartite racial hierarchy, which came to predominate in New Orleans, as well as many Caribbean societies. So you have on the sort of top of the society, you have free white people. These are merchants and enslavers, et cetera, free white people. Then you have below that free Black people, of which there's a sizable population in New Orleans. And at the bottom of the social hierarchy, you have enslaved people who are either African-born or more likely, as the antebellum period continued, to be American-born, people who were from the Upper South and shipped to New Orleans and Louisiana through the domestic slave trade. So with this racial hierarchy came to exist another invisible hierarchy. So you have on the top of this hierarchy, yellow fever survivors. These are so-called acclimated citizens. These are people who have survived and have sufficiently proved to their peers, whether through stories or through their symptoms or through doctors' assurances, that they have survived yellow fever. Below them, you have so-called unacclimated strangers. This is, by the way, the language they used: acclimated citizen and unacclimated strangers. And unacclimated strangers are essentially these people who were kind of in this purgatory. These are mostly recent immigrants. These are white people, recent immigrants, new to New Orleans, who have not yet had their brush with yellow fever. People who are either too scared of it and so escape during the fever season, or else just haven't had a run-in with it yet. And they're sort of existing in this kind of social and professional purgatory, where they can't say they survived this, and so they often can't get jobs. They often can't mix in certain social circles. They're considered to be sort of untested, as it were. And then on the bottom rung of this hierarchy are the dead, but also the dead, I should say, in this logic, these are people who are considered to have been sort of immoral in the first place. They weren't of sufficient grit to have survived anyways. But also in this group are those people. So this is some free Black people, but also all enslaved people. These are the people for whom immunity or acclimation added nothing to their own personal, social, or economic self-worth. So their immunity or the value of their acclimation devolved onto other people, most especially their white enslavers. And so you have this sort of hierarchy of immunity that develops, this invisibly develops, which commingles with and exacerbates this racial hierarchy. And it made it a very miserable place to live, in fact, too. But this fundamentally infused the entire class and racial structure of New Orleans and led to the system that I call immuno-capitalism, which is a system of class rule whereby the acclimated elites essentially weaponize disease to discipline the population and to increase their wealth and to fundamentally extract more from this society. And this is a system, in fact, it arose in New Orleans because elites here saw disease, like anything else, as a tool that they could use to increase their power, just as all capitalists do.
Yeah, maybe we could talk a little bit more about how that actually worked on the ground, because one of the things that struck me as, besides the fact that this racial kind of perception of Africans having some sort of instinctual inborn immunity, which we'll talk about in a minute, there was a tremendous amount of Europeans coming over, mainly Irish and English, right? And or German, sorry. And that status seemed very tenuous and kind of created a hellscape that I hadn't really thought of in that way.
Yeah. One of the questions that still keeps me up at night, actually, is I often wonder this. So, if you could go anywhere in the world, why would you go to New Orleans in the 1850s, let's say, a place where you effectively cut your life short by 20 years? This is a place that has epidemic yellow fever every second or third summer, a place that spends essentially no tax dollars on seeking to ameliorate, health-related problems. This is a miserable place to live. And really, until you have passed this sort of yellow fever Rubicon, this society does not care about you. And they're actually quite explicit about that. They just, elites here, politicians and businessmen, they say, nobody asked you to come here. It is your job to, sort of public health is private acclimation. It is your job to face yellow fever alone. That's your prerogative. And once you survive, then come and talk to us. Then we'll treat with you. Then we'll deal with you. Then we'll help you make money through cotton and sugar and slavery. But before then, you are essentially, you are worthless to us politically and economically. And, you see this, it's actually sort of heartbreaking to see. And people came to New Orleans, actually, so New York was by far the biggest immigrant destination in the 19th century before the Civil War. It's the major port of entry. But people came to New Orleans for a few different reasons. One, because this was considered to be the gateway to the sort of Midwest. So if you were going to Arkansas or Kansas or even to California, you would probably go through New Orleans because you would go up Mississippi River and then out west. But also, there was no health check at New Orleans, which meant that, so if you had if you were sick, if you were worried about getting caught by some kind of health officer, and if you were worried about getting caught in a quarantine in New York or in Philadelphia or Boston, why not try your sort of hand at New Orleans, where there was no health check and you would be guaranteed entry, essentially. Entry for you and your mother who might be sickly or your child who might be sickly. So it was a sort of safer bet in that respect. But you see these letters from people, they know that, people in Germany or escaping the Irish potato famine, they know abstractly about yellow fever in New Orleans, and they're facing, of course, horrific things at home. And so perhaps like their sort of metrics of suffering are just different than ours are today. They knew abstractly about what life was like in New Orleans. They knew about yellow fever, but knowing about something intellectually is different than meeting it, for yourself on the ground. And you see this like constant sort of, it's every year you see this where, people arrive, they're sort of optimistic about New Orleans, to say, oh, it's not as bad as I heard about. And then, that summer, an entire family is struck down by yellow fever. And, this is very much statistically, in the norm. And people are very good at writing themselves out of statistics and thinking, well, I'll be different, only to meet a pretty, grim fate. So, yeah.
Well, I kind of wanted to touch too on what the government of New Orleans, the city government, and then later the state government kind of thought about. You kind of say three things in the book, what they were most concerned about. And maybe you could kind of, because it wasn't sanitation and the place was just a bit of like just filth, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe you could talk about kind of what they thought their role was in.
Sure.
In this environment.
So I should preface this by saying, New Orleans, in fact, is it's not a very good place for a city. It is situated very low down on the Mississippi River. It was founded by the French in 1718. Native Americans have lived there for many years, on the portage for many thousands of years. The place where New Orleans is now was a portage between like Pontchartrain and the Mississippi River. It was relatively high ground in the Mississippi Delta, but again, we're really in a swamp here. So most of the city sits about 1 foot above sea level, though the sort of levee fronting the river, that's the sort of natural and man-made barrier between, that's sort of blocking the river's progress. That's about 15 feet at the very, very edge of the river, but really the rest of the city is basically at the water table. So water has been this problem, it still is a huge problem in New Orleans, and it's been this problem, since its very foundation. And so, we have water from hurricanes, water from the rising river, you have water seeping up from the ground. It's just everywhere. And so, from the earliest dispatches we have of New Orleans being in the 18th century, when it was a French and Spanish town, you have these colonial officials and farmers there basically writing to Madrid, writing to Paris, saying, this is the filthiest place I've ever been in my entire life. This is disgusting. You can't leave a pair of shoes outside for an evening without it being covered in mildew by the next morning. It's just in the streets of New Orleans, back in the day, basically these are mud waterways, and you would walk on these very little sort of thin, skinny risers on the side of the streets and hope not to fall into the morass. So this has always been, a sort of a physically bad sight for a city. But as New Orleans grew over the course of the 18th century, and then especially after the 1790s, when sugar and cotton sort of swept this region, and then even more especially after Louisiana Purchase, when Americans took control and people poured into the region, hoping to get in on the ground floor of cotton and also sugar. This is white people coming from the East Coast. The population is exploding. And basically this is unsustainable because we have this city that's already kind of struggling to fulfill basic parts of sanitation. And then you have people pouring in, and we have houses that are just coming up, left, right, and center all over the place in the swamp. And so this battle to drain has always been behind, shall I say, the sort of demand of the population. But city elites here, and so we have, so unlike other American cities, so other American cities have a problem with yellow fever at various points. There are some very famous and staggering epidemics of yellow fever, for example, in Philadelphia in 1793. or else in Boston or New York, or especially in Charleston and other southern cities. But by the 19th century, yellow fever is, most Americans would sort of at the time would have associated yellow fever almost exclusively with yellow fever with New Orleans. Those two, the sort of disease and the city were, it was the paradigmatic disease of New Orleans. And city officials here, however, they sort of take an opposite approach to what city officials do elsewhere. So in New York, in Philadelphia, in Norfolk, in Baltimore, this is not a perfect system, but you see increasingly the state, so that this is mostly the sort of municipal government of these cities taking responsibility over the people's health. And so that means that they install quarantines, that they establish orphanages, that they create, almshouses to distribute candles and meat and other, blankets and things like this to survivors. They're sort of establishing, they develop hospitals too. That's a major one. They set up state hospitals that are free. And not all of these interventions work, but actually a lot of them do work, especially things like, when cities take sort of active measures to sanitize the city. So water down streets, dry them out, et cetera. Clean them up, literally. New Orleans takes the exact opposite approach to this. They do essentially none of this whatsoever. They, in fact, spend significantly less money per person on public health than any other major American city. So Boston in 1850, I think, spends 69 cents per person per year on public health. New Orleans spends something like 2 cents per person. This is, factors and factors less money, almost nothing. And so this is kind of a paradox, so why would the deadliest city in America, with this annual, this biannual problem of yellow fever, why did this deadliest city with triple the national mortality average spend the least amount in terms of public health? And so it is my contention that essentially elites here said that they essentially said that yellow fever was a problem without a solution. So they said, quarantines, they might work in Paris or in London or New York, but that meant nothing in New Orleans. Just because they work there doesn't have any bearing on whether they would work here. And fundamentally, this is the problem that, no amount of tax dollars can really change this. So it's folly to try, and it's a waste of money. So their whole attitude is this, not even laissez-faire, it's active negligence. They just basically say, this is not within our remit. So the things they do, the city government, the city councils, it's actually really shocking. So you see this time and again during the major epidemics of yellow fever. So in 1833, for example, in 1853, I remember being in the archives and looking at the minutes. This is during some of the worst epidemics in the city's history, when literally thousands of people are dying a week. And you see no mention at all of disease. You see no appropriations for disease. You see no money being spent. There's no sort of ad hoc committees being set up. There's nothing. They're talking about the most mundane issues, like, do we have enough, oil for the lamp on Royal Street? And you think 10 people just died on Royal Street just now, and they just do not talk about it. It's not even out of mind, out of sight. It's just a complete abdication of what we would now, especially, but even then, people would consider to be, the first duty of government, which is to protect, the lives of inhabitants. And they just say, absolutely not. And they're sort of justified in this because fundamentally, there's no group of people holding them accountable within New Orleans. So, the business community, they don't want quarantine. First of all, businessmen here, they all claim to be immune anyways. They say, we survived yellow fever. It's not our job to protect people's lives. It's our job to help them make money once they survive, and they can get into business in that way. And the business community, and businessmen everywhere hate quarantines. That's as true in Melbourne as it is in, London, as it is in Calcutta, everywhere. But here, they have basically, the entire city council is comprised of businessmen. Sort of commercial civic elite, they really are, one entire whole here, and they don't want that. So, okay. And they don't want sanitation because they say, the good, the sort of parts of the city that I live in, those are relatively clean. That's the sort of where the cotton offices are, where the, factories and merchant houses are in the French Quarter. And by the way, I'm not going to be in New Orleans anyways during the summer because I'm going to go retreat to my country plantation, or else I'm going to go to the theater in New York, or I'll take my family on a trip to London where I'll talk to my bankers anyways. And so they're not physically present in the city during any of these moments anyways. And so essentially you see this in, another kind of class divide in which during epidemics, those who could not afford or didn't have the freedom to flee are stuck in this, miserable city, there to essentially, weather this disease, live or die.
Yeah, and you touched on the idea of if you die, it's a moral failing. You were an alcoholic. You were some sort of degenerate. That's kind of the white story. But let's talk about the enslaved people and
Sure.
how that. What I was most fascinated with was enslavement and then post-emancipation, and kind of how that story changed, because it seems to me so indicative of how not only New Orleans tells its story, but also America kind of tells the story of African Americans overall.
Sure. So one of the most sort of vexing parts of writing this book, or I suppose for any historian who studies slavery and slave societies, is understanding the inherent contradictions and layers of cognitive dissonance that is present within one society. So one of the sort of most beloved truths of pro-slavery theorists and doctors and slaveholders and politicians in and around New Orleans in the Deep South was this fact, I say, quote unquote. And this fact was that all Black people, no matter where they were from, were, quote unquote, perfectly immune to yellow fever. So this quote, perfectly immune to yellow fever, this comes from a very famous pro-slavery theorist called Dr. Samuel Cartwright. Samuel Cartwright, by the 1850s, was, he was a virulent racist, and he wrote many, many tracts defending slavery, and he was known for his sort of medical take on slavery. And he famously came up with the disease called drapetomania, which is the disease causing slaves to run away, apparently. So this man is a huge racist, but there were many other doctors who subscribed to this. So what's really interesting about this is that you have this belief on the one hand that all Black people were either perfectly immune or at least highly, highly resistant to yellow fever. So you have this on the one hand, this belief, but on the other hand, you have the observations of planters. You see these in private letters and in diaries, the observations of planters that suggest that they were constantly petrified every time an epidemic rolled around because they knew that Black people could and did die from yellow fever. And even sort of twisting the screw even here a little bit more. So you have this belief on the one hand in perfect Black immunity, but modern epidemiologists have discovered no mechanism for the hereditary resistance of yellow fever, meaning that immunity cannot pass from parent to child in utero through the placenta. It doesn't happen. Other diseases, you can pass on immunity to, but this doesn't happen. And that's true, regardless of race. This is true across the board. So every single person must face this disease by themselves and gain immunity, or else become vaccinated. If you're lucky enough to live in the 20th century. So you have this fundamental and inherent paradox here, which is that you have planters and politicians saying one thing and thinking another. And you wonder, why do they do this? So in a slave society where people literally are embodied capital, shouldn't yellow fever and these routine epidemics have been at the top of the concern list for many enslavers who, of course, would, in their logic, worry every time an epidemic rolls around because they're worried that, their bottom line is going to be affected here, that every epidemic will see dozens of people swept off and thus, will hurt their prospects, especially if they're, cash for planters. And I think basically that this logic sort of came to flourish in the Deep South because it was very useful. It was actually too useful for them. It was too useful of a lie for them to check too rigorously. There's a saying in journalism, right? That's too good to check or something. It was sort of like that. Where because if they had this, if they sort of maintained with this, righteousness that all Black people were immune to yellow fever, they could use it as a justification for the spread and entrenchment of Black slavery across a greater and greater area. And so in their logic, as they say, and they start saying this, by the way, very early on during the American period, they start using essentially yellow fever as a justification for why slavery should be extended to the Deep South, and for why it was not just acceptable, but actually humanitarian, or even a positive good for this society. Because they say essentially that Black people who have been given this special immunity by God, as a sign that God wanted Black people to be working specifically in the Deep South, because of the special immunity, Black people could be working, could work in the most exposed and dangerous spaces. So the levee, docklands, very cramped sugar plantations, very hot and cramped sugar plantations, all of these spaces, they can clear swamps in the lower Mississippi Valley. They can work in all these places because they have this immunity. And this is good because it literally protects the health of whites, because it protected them from labor in spaces that would kill them. And you used to have people saying this with literally, without a glimmer of anything on their faces. They believe this wholeheartedly. But then, one more even, twist on this too. So they believe this on the one hand, or at least they say they believe this. But if you were to walk into any slave mart on Esplanade in New Orleans, that's the major slave trading port. Every part of the city was essentially a slave mart in some capacity. You would be inundated with all sorts of, you would be inundated with all sorts of lies about a person. This is Walter Johnson talked about this at great length in his wonderful book, Soul by Soul. This is, from about 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But, you would be, there were all sorts of ways that enslaved people were advertised to maximize prices and to hasten a sale. And so people would be described as choice or likely, or they'd be, the best cotton picker of the bunch, et cetera. And acclimated was a very, very common descriptor in slave sale advertisements, because this guaranteed, or this, really basically translated to a higher price. And in fact, between 25 and 50% more. That is a substantial amount of money more. And so you see enslavers who are seeking to buy a person, they're always trying to discern, what does that actually mean? So they'll ask all sorts of probing questions of a person and say, so how long have you been in the South? Where are you from originally? So you're from Virginia. How long were you in Alabama last winter? Have you had yellow fever? What were your symptoms? You'll see enslavers spitting this absolute sort of this string of questions seeking to determine the truthfulness of this person's acclimation, and whether or not this was one more slave trader's lie, or whether this was a real thing. And they're doing this, of course, because if acclimated the way they see it, the value and safety of the capital that they invest in an enslaved person is safer.
And then post emancipation, it kind of shifts again, because suddenly, they were immune during slavery, but now the freed slaves are suddenly somehow their immunity changes.
Oh, it's totally ridiculous. And it's enough to make your head spin. So you see this basically right in 1865, 1866. We're talking right after the Civil War, right after Emancipation, right after the 13th Amendment. You see the same people who 10 years before were saying that Black people had this sort of natural immunity as on the basis of their race. They now say, no, it wasn't on the basis of race that Black people were made immune. It was actually on the basis of the slave condition. So, Black skin had nothing to do with it. In fact, it was slave status. And now that these people are free, we're going to start to see, this is a humanitarian crisis, because we're going to start to see Black people die in droves. That this is, this is a travesty, one more sin of the abolitionists, one more sin of Abraham Lincoln and his radical Republicans, that they, fundamentally don't understand the epidemiological landscape of the South, whereas, we white Southerners do. And of course, it's not, this is alchemy, of course. This is, this really is, does not reflect reality at all. And, in fact, actually, there was an uptick in Black death after the Civil War, not from yellow fever, but from a variety of other diseases, especially smallpox and diseases. This is, when you have a lot of people who are basically you have a sort of migrant crisis after the Civil War, a refugee crisis, if you will, of people who are malnourished, who are back from war. You see a lot of disease spread around, and there is an increased number of deaths. But this is taken as an example of, by opportunistic whites as to why emancipation was bad in the first place. Why this is an example of how it's taken as an example of how Black people cannot look after themselves and in freedom, whereas they had been healthier and safer and had been longer lived under the paternalistic care of white enslavers. And this is all a part of this constellation of new and highly convenient myths that whites told about Black people in this new political economy of emancipation.
Well, and that's so interesting because, what I liked about your book, too, is you really do kind of locate some of these crazy ideologies where there's this huge cognitive dissonance in the face of this terrible disease. We've seen, they didn't keep the city clean. They didn't do any quarantining. They didn't do any sanitation. Then they say African Americans are, immune because they're inferior, and then they're not immune, and it's this constant twisting around of this ideology that just seems so it's so present today too, right? Because you see it kind of has continued through even the hatred of the expert or the North, or the state versus the federal. So I don't know if you want to get into that real quickly or not.
Sure. This is I can go into this briefly, where it's this, it's like arguing with a stairmaster or something. This sort of, it's like this whataboutist attitude. You're never actually ever having a good faith conversation with any of these yellow fever ideologues. And I call it an ideology, actually, because you have the disease on the one hand, but then this ideology is the way that people think about it and manipulate disease to further their ends. And you can never, there's no consistency. It's all sort of opportunistic. It's all in bad faith, I should say, too. And one of the things that I find, as you just mentioned here, too, just to sort of hammer home. So in addition to, the belief in sort of small government, a belief in Black immunity, you have this also really paranoid sort of ideology coming about in the 1850s, where you have people who have lost children to yellow fever, people who have themselves faced it, who will publicly say, yellow fever is not a problem in New Orleans. This is all one giant conspiracy that Northern abolitionists are making up to discredit the South. This is, and by the way, they have no business doing that because their factories are awful. They have tuberculosis in droves in New York anyways. Why are they obsessed with yellow fever in New Orleans? It's, this is all basically fake news that the North has concocted simply to undermine and undercut the economy of the South at this, key moment in the 1850s. And it's almost unbelievable, except that we see it all the time today too. And you can see the same attitude, this, the constantly moving benchmarks, this almost paranoid style that reverberates, and also the ways that, disease, which, viruses don't think, humans think, and we manipulate diseases to, we can manipulate diseases to further our sort of social and political and economic ends in all sorts of ways. And we've seen that happen with COVID, most decidedly, in some different ways, but also in some pretty similar ways too, people seeking to sort of engraft disease with all sorts of moral meaning.
And that's a whole other topic for another day. But I kind of like you to wrap up with just kind of what happened in New Orleans. I know we skipped over the entire war and Butler and all that, but post-war, it did suffer, right? It wasn't the same economic powerhouse it was.
Sure. So in one sentence, New Orleans, during the Civil War, actually experienced the lowest death rate that it had for over 6 decades. This is because the Union Army occupied it early and instituted a very strict quarantine and also sanitized the city. This is under Benjamin Butler, who was much hated by New Orleanians, but also Southerners in general. So yellow fever did not visit New Orleans during the Civil War, but after the war, almost immediately, basically all of the old city councilors and mayors and state legislators, they were basically reinstalled into their pre-war positions. And right away, yellow fever comes back because they adopt the same attitude as before. And so we have, pretty bad epidemics that take place in 67, and then again in 1870, excuse me. And you see the sort of disease returning again. However, the sort of ground is shifting beneath New Orleans' feet. So before the war, New Orleans had been, the behemoth of cotton and sugar. This was the United States' biggest commodity exporting city. And it was that basically by dint of its position on the lower Mississippi. So all of the goods of the Mississippi Valley have to flow past New Orleans to be shipped around the world. But things are changing, even by the 1850s, but really you can see this by the 1860s and 70s because of railways. So New Orleans they kind of got on the railway train. That's a metaphor there, I guess, double metaphor. They kind of got on this a little bit too late, actually. So you see other states that invested in railroad infrastructure, and no longer do sort of small inland towns in Mississippi or in Texas especially have to rely on New Orleans and the Mississippi steamboat trade, which is quite slow and actually quite dangerous because steamboats have a tendency to blow up. They can now ship their cotton more directly to Atlanta or even to Chicago, which can then be put onto, this is by rail. And so you see New Orleans' position relative to other cities within sort of the domestic cotton market waning slightly. Coupled with this also is that you have immigration essentially shuts down. So before the war, where, about 500,000 white people really immigrated to the United States through New Orleans in the antebellum period, that river comes down to a very small trickle after the war. That's true for across the South, but that's really noticeable in New Orleans. And so you have this problem where not only is more and more product getting diverted away from New Orleans, so it's no longer the sort of economic powerhouse that it once was, but you also, the sort of elites of New Orleans can no longer rely on this replacement model. So before the war, they'd said, we don't have to invest in public health because, people die, but come every boat will have replacements, fresh people who will be cheap labor to resupply, whatever we need them to do with. So they no longer can rely on that. So increasingly to the elite, very slowly, increasingly but slowly, they move into this direction of the mantra that they adopt by the very end of the 1870s is public health is public wealth. They don't really adopt that. That's always more lip service than it is in kind. But they become lucky actually because yellow fever, through a combination of factors, actually starts to sort of taper off slightly across the Greater Caribbean by the end of the 1870s. There's a very serious epidemic in 1879, and then thereafter, 25,000 people died across the Mississippi Valley. But thereafter, epidemics are sort of fewer and farther between. And the last one is in 1905 in New Orleans. And, by that point, New Orleans really was no longer could call itself a sort of the major cotton city anymore. So its position had declined, but also, perhaps as a sort of lucky side effect of there being less immigration, yellow fever also dissipated somewhat too. So you see the sort of New Orleans decline alongside, the sort of abatement of yellow fever as well.
Well, thank you for your work and your explanation of all this. And it's incredibly fascinating. And it's a crazy story when you think about them.
Well, my pleasure. I always feel like if people at the end of this pandemic have the stomach to read about disease, then I'm delighted, obviously. But fingers crossed that people still do.